Chapter 10, School. Have you ever sat down and tried to figure out roughly how much time you have spent in school, just from kindergarten to grade 12? How many hours you've spent in a classroom? Even if we just start at junior kindergarten, so we're not including early learning, and we only include grade 12, so no college or university or other training, and not including anything extracurricular that occurs on school grounds or any kind of after school programs or anything else. Well, on average, a student in North America spends about 1,000 hours a year in school. So if you add in JK and SK, that means about 14,000 hours just for what is considered a standard basic education, just the minimum. And if you look at this chart on the slide, you can see that this varies quite a bit depending on the country. For example, in Ontario, we have more school days per year than the US, but Japan is way ahead of us, and South Korea beats us all. So either their school year starts earlier and lasts longer, or they have fewer days off, or both. But that's a really significant difference. Now, the average number of hours per day can also vary substantially. If you look at Finland with 5 hours a day is the least, and Taiwan with the most hours per day at 8.5. That's a big difference. That's 3.5 hours per day more. Even in one single country, there may be differences in how children are educated and what's considered to be an education. So, for example, in Canada, we don't have one unified federal education system. Instead, there's differences between provinces and territories. Now, yes, in Canada, a free education is provided to all. In fact, it's compulsory up to the age of 16 in every province except for Manitoba, Ontario, and New Brunswick, where the compulsory age is 18, or as soon as a high school diploma has been achieved. And yes, being educated is mandatory. It's not a choice except in specific circumstances. I should say attending school is mandatory. So for example, if a parent wanted to homeschool their child in Ontario, they're required to notify the school board of their intent in writing and to do so every year. And once they do that, the school board considers the child to be excused from attendance at school in accordance with the Education Act, because the letter is considered evidence that the parents are providing satisfactory instruction at home. And this won't be investigated unless there are reasonable grounds to suspect that the child's not receiving satisfactory instruction at home, either because the parent hasn't notified the board in writing, or there's a credible report or concern by a third party that something's going on. So if there's evidence that the child was removed from attendance at school because of ongoing conflict with the school, not for the purpose of homeschooling, or there's a history of absenteeism by the child prior to the parents notifying the board of the intent to provide homeschooling. But in Newfoundland and Labrador, it's different. Parents in Newfoundland and Labrador have to apply to a school district to homeschool their children every year. And they're permitted to homeschool their children only with approval from the Director of Education. An educational program is administered outside of school, then using the provincially authorized curriculum or an alternative curriculum that the province recognizes. And if the homeschooling program in Newfoundland and Labrador is the provincially authorized curriculum, then the parents have access to teaching resources for the courses from the Department of Education. And student resources will be available from the school that the student would have been registered in. In Alberta, it's different. The parent has to notify the school board every year, but in Alberta, it's the parent's responsibility, 100%, to plan and manage and provide and evaluate and supervise their kids' education. Then, whatever school board accepts the parent's notification becomes what is known as the Associate School Authority, and it's their responsibility to provide the parents with support if asked. So why are there different rules in every province and territory in Canada regarding homeschooling? Because Canada does not have a unified federal education program. Instead, every province and territory in Canada is responsible for its own education system. Now, is this something most of us think about very much? No, because it's not something most of us need to think about. So in practice, what this means is there's no standard common curriculum across Canada. What you study in each grade and in each subject may not be the same as what you would study in each grade and in each subject in another part of the country. Now, there are not likely going to be really substantial, huge differences, but there are differences. And then in Nunavut, which didn't become a territory until April 1st, 1999, when it officially split from the Northwest Territories, they still don't have a full standard curriculum. Instead, they'll use parts of the curriculum from Alberta, Manitoba, and the Northwest Territories, and some of their own that has been developed. Now, because our education system is not controlled federally, this is why it's possible for there to be different laws regarding mandatory education, with the age of compulsory attendance being 16 in some parts of Canada and 18 in other parts. And unless you are taking this course or traveling or you have friends or family living in another country, you probably don't consider the fact that other countries, other societies do things differently when it comes to education. I would say we have a tendency, maybe a natural human tendency, to think that the way things are now are the way they've always been, and that's the way they are everywhere. I mean, we know that's not true. We know society has changed and evolved, but we don't really have a reason to recognize that evolution. The fact is that going to school all day for the majority of the year has not always been the norm. Instead, you'd be much, much more likely to spend your days working alongside your parents and whatever they did to support the family financially, which was usually farming, since historically 93% of Canada's economy was based on agriculture. So parents needed their children to help run the family farm, not just to help out a bit, to actually sustain it and keep the family going. And in addition, for the very few young people that did not work with their family, a formal education in the way we think of it now simply wasn't needed. This was before the concept of a knowledge economy existed, an economy based on information technology and services, instead of being based on producing an actual product that you can see. And this is essentially the situation currently in many developing countries. Basic education during childhood is not a guarantee. And if a child does receive some education when they're really young, in many developing countries, once they reach adolescence, that stops and they begin to work with their parents. It's just the way it is. It is the norm for these countries, just as it is the norm here for the vast majority to at least complete high school. So with all of this in mind, in many ways, reading this chapter in the textbook is going to sound a little bit like a history lesson, because our education system and our society have really been completely enmeshed with each other in every way possible. So as society has changed, our education system has reflected that. Now remember, this is a course focused on adolescence, so we are focusing on the part of education that would typically be for people of that age, which means secondary school or high school and junior high. It isn't that there isn't anything else to say about the development of the elementary system, it just isn't our focus. Really, the main point regarding high school and junior high in developed countries, including Canada and the US, is that these are fairly recent developments. We did not always have laws in place stating that a person had to be in school full-time until a certain age. We just didn't. It wasn't really until the early 1900s that this was given much consideration. And slowly but surely, different provinces and territories and states began to pass laws regarding mandatory school attendance. So another way of saying this is that mandatory school attendance made formal schooling a normative experience for young people. So think about that expression, a normative experience. It became a typical, normal, expected experience of childhood and adolescence. So that if somebody didn't have these academic encounters, then they would in some ways have an abnormal childhood or an abnormal adolescence. Now, in your text, they provide you several statistics highlighting literacy rates in developing countries based on a person's age. And what this does is it demonstrates that the older generation is still much more, or still has much higher illiteracy rates than the younger generation. And what these stats demonstrate is that going to school was not a normative experience for the older generation, but going to school has become a normative experience for the younger generation. And there's more than one reason for being educated becoming a normative experience, and we'll talk about those in this chapter. In addition to changes that have occurred in both developing and developed countries regarding secondary education. Now, when you read the text, it's clear. I certainly don't think it was poorly written, but I'm a very logically minded person, and for me, that always means summarizing information, paying attention to the main points. So in summarizing all this, the first thing I want to point out is that as a secondary school education evolved, it was not a super quick process. It took place over several decades. In the beginning, it wasn't just mainly, but absolutely only for the children of families who were pretty wealthy, only their male children. So sorry ladies, we simply were not part of the equation. And it becomes even more narrow because it was only wealthy male and likely white males. And their secondary education would be very different from what we think of it as now. So there was no thought given to how is this going to help me find employment. They were educated for the sake of being educated. So they studied pretty general subjects like art or history or literature. And yes, even in North America, Greek and Latin. In fact, it was standard for Greek and Latin to continue to be offered in high school right up into the 1960s. So this shift from secondary schools only being for wealthy white boys did eventually change. Not rapidly, but it did change. And so did the subjects these students were studying, so that instead of studying information and being educated just for the sake of being educated, a more standard curriculum evolved that was much more practical in nature. What this means is that education that would actually assist a person in gaining and keeping employment, education that would prepare a student for employment or further study. This is known as a comprehensive high school, and it's a high school that includes classes in general education, college preparation, and vocational training. This is what we have now. From the 1920s onward, the number of adolescents attending junior high and high school slowly but surely grew, so that by the time the 21st century came around, it was absolutely the norm for the vast majority of young people to attend junior high and high school, although these days they may be combined into one school. And our curriculum has continued to evolve as well, focusing more and more on preparing students for our knowledge economy. And your text speaks about the curriculum in the US and that it's not standard across the entire country. Remember, Canada is the same, although there are not likely to be any huge differences between provinces and territories. Now, whether I was teaching this course or not, I've always personally found it interesting how different societies approach standardized education. We're so used to the way we do it. We're so used to our system. We just don't really seem to consider very often the way another country does it, and maybe they might do it better. Maybe that's because people as a whole don't like to change. I don't even like it when things are moved in my grocery store, especially when that change will affect children. And this is demonstrated every time even the smallest little change is proposed for the provincial curriculum, and there's an uproar. Not just the sex ed curriculum, any of it. But having gone through Teachers College myself and having friends that have taught or lived in different areas of the world, like Korea or England or Saudi Arabia or Dubai or Germany, I'm always really interested to see how they do the exact same things that we do differently. For us, it's just the norm to have a junior high and high school, a secondary school system. Singular, only one kind of middle school and only one kind of secondary school. Now, we might have different boards. So you have English public, English Catholic, French public, French Catholic, etc. But we still have one kind of school. It isn't like college or university where you have a lot of people studying different things at the same school. It's just school. So while we are used to this system, it isn't perfect. And one of the main drawbacks of it is that every student is in one school with one approach, with the same classes to choose from, even though there's differences between them. Differences in interests, differences in strengths and weaknesses, differences in what students might want to eventually do after school. And this is why in some developed countries, they actually have different kinds of secondary schools for students to choose from.